Hi, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming today. So we're going to be recording this event, and we're going to ask everybody to please stay muted while we have the presentations. There will be time to unmute yourselves and ask questions during the question and answer period. And so at that time, we'll give direction. But if you have any questions during the talk, you're welcome to add them to the chat, and then we'll get to you to ask your question at the end during the question and answer.
Thank you, Mary. Sorry, Ines, go ahead.
Just to give you a little feedback of how we got started with all this workshop during Zoom. Regent Park Safety Network in collaboration with Mothers of Peace, we got a SIF grant from the United Way. And we've been doing workshops since last year, and this year is the second year. We've hosted mental health. What is mental health? Overdose prevention, anxiety in youth and adults, know your legal rights, financial literacy, back to basics, grieving the unspoken journey, accessibility for the visual impaired, Black history and the news, mental health vaccine. Today we're hosting anti-Black racism. To the SIF grant, we even did mental health first aid. We did 3 sessions of 10 people in each session. So we've done already with 30 residents, and there'll be more coming. And we provide food and child mining. Please follow us on our Facebook and Instagram under Mothers of Peace. And soon we're starting, we received grants from the city, the social development plan from the city, where we're doing training certificates. So our first training certificate, it will be Speaking with Confidence, that it will start on May 18. It's every 6 sessions from 1 to 3 on Tuesdays. And there will be food provided and child mining if needed. Prioritizing TCAC residents. And that's, and I would like to say thank you to, like I said, United Way, the Regent Park Safety Network, Toronto Housing, CCLD, and Mothers of Peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Ines. Maybe we could introduce her with land acknowledgement. Ines, maybe you could take it on.
I would like to introduce Jan Zent. She's a resident of the community. She was born here in Regent, a long time resident, and she's a youth. And welcome, Jan Zent, and please go right ahead.
So co-host, please mute yourself. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to be reading the land acknowledgement. The scarred land on which we operate is a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron, Wamba, and Putin First Nation, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississauga of Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with the Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So if you have any question, you could put it in the chat, and I'm gonna call on Fareeda. Fareeda was here last year when we did Know Your Right workshops, and a lot of people in the community was asking me if we could have Fareeda again. So that's why Fareeda is here. She came back again. If we could turn off everybody the video and we could do spotlight Fareeda. So if you have any question while she's presenting, please put it in the chat, and we will have question and answer session at the end. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so hi everybody. My name is Fareeda Adam. I am currently a staff lawyer at the Black Legal Action Center. I was called to the bar in 2015. I have worked in all sorts of contexts, usually with low to no income folks, racialized folks in the family context, child protection context, and the criminal context. So I'm glad to be back here today to talk about Anti-Black Racism 101. I think last time we spoke about policing. Today it's going to be a little bit more broad, and we're going to get into some of the terminology and some of the systems that we encounter at Black that we see our clients affected by. And again, like if you have any other questions, I'm sure at the end you can ask those questions and I'm happy to answer them. Okay. So this is a presentation overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do at Black, then I'm going to get into the language and terminology. Then I'm going to have we're going to have a conversation about the manifestations of anti-Black racism. And then briefly, I'm going to touch on data collection, and then hopefully we can have a discussion. So these are today's objectives. A lot of the terms and a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today are probably things that you've all encountered, you all know, but I think it's a good refresher for everyone, including myself, to constantly be reminded about the language and the terms that we're using. Okay. So I work at the Black Legal Action Center. We're a community legal aid clinic. We're a specialty legal aid clinic. Essentially, our mandate is to combat anti-Black racism within the province. So if you are low or no income and you encounter anti-Black racism in housing, in policing, in education, or in human rights, just more broadly, please feel free to reach out to Black, and we are happy to help. And so these are the areas of law that we do work in. And I think it was important to talk about a vision, right? When we talk about anti-Black racism, what is our vision? Our vision is a society where anti-Black racism is named, it's meaningfully addressed, where the humanity and dignity of Black people are centered, where the laws and the legal systems are reflective of the real experiences of Black people, and where racial equity and the full participation of all Black people in society is achieved. And we know that that's a lofty goal, but that's really the point of all of this work. And we know that we stand on the shoulders of the people that came before us, and lawyers like Selwyn, who have worked in this community for years before we even came into existence. So when we're talking about Black people in the province of Ontario, I think it's good to start with some numbers. So generally, this is how many Black people we have in the province of Ontario. Most of those individuals live in Toronto. We know that the Black Ontarian population is a youthful population, so we have quite a number of young people. And we know that more than half of the Black population in Ontario was born outside of the country. So these are important things to keep in mind when we're talking about some of the issues facing the Black community, right? These things are connected. Okay, so when we talk about anti-Black racism, it's become, a term that we've seen discussed quite a bit, especially with George Floyd, but even before that. So when we talk about anti-Black racism, we're talking about systems, policies embedded within Canadian institutions that reflect beliefs, attitudes, prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination that is directed to Black people. And it's rooted in our unique history of enslavement and colonization. And we want to make sure that we're crediting the Black woman who came up with this term. And so we credit Dr. Akua Benjamin. She is a Ryerson social work professor, and she was the one who coined this term anti-Black racism. And so when we talk about anti-Black racism broadly, often what we hear people talk about is interpersonal racism. So someone says something to you that is racist. That's what we call interpersonal racism, as opposed to a broader systemic conversation about anti-Black racism. And within interpersonal racism, right? So when someone says, calls you a racial slur, or verbally or physically attacks you in a discriminatory way, there are microaggressions. And microaggressions are a bit more complicated, and this is something that we're navigating at Black, right? When someone is subject to a subtle slight or statement or action that is done in a coded way that it becomes really hard to identify as racism. And so we all know this, right? When someone says something really subtle to you or to your friend or colleague, and it's not explicitly racist in a way that you can say, this is clearly anti-Black racism, but it's done in a way that is coded so that that person can preserve deniability. And so it's these subtle ways that we see anti-Black racism manifest, especially when we talk about interpersonal anti-Black racism. So these are examples of microaggressions. These are all examples of things that were said to me directly. You're so articulate. I did not think you would do so well. That was said to me by a professor in law school. Your name is so hard to pronounce. What makes my name hard to pronounce as opposed to your name, right? Their names. My name is hard to pronounce if it's compared to what we call a normal white name, right? So that means whiteness is centered, and anything that is not white is the other and different and weird. That is also included in conversations about Black hair. What makes Black hair different? You're surprisingly smart. You're pretty for a Black girl, right? These are types of microaggressions that are done in a coded way, but if you are Black or racialized, you know exactly what the purpose and the intent of those kinds of comments are. And they're extremely difficult to deal with because, again, the person is doing or engaging in anti-Black racism in a coded way that allows that person to preserve the right to say, I didn't mean that, or that's based on your interpretation, right? So you get manipulated to think that actually it's you who's overreacting. And so that's what we see a lot of too. And I mean, obviously, these are things that have been personally said to me. So we all know what that is. So when we talk about anti-Black racism, we also have to talk about privilege and power. And when again, you hear this term a lot, people talk about white privilege and the notion of privilege. Privilege is simply the unfair advantages given to some people, but not others based on their identity or position in society. And privilege connects really meaningfully, I guess, with power, being the dominant group. So when you connect the two, all of a sudden you have a dominant group that gets to kind of define the rules of the game. And that this is the tension I think we're all dealing with when we're talking about anti-Black racism and doing work in this field. And obviously, this all sort of connects with white supremacy more broadly, right? And white supremacy, this conscious or unconscious ideas that white superiority, entitlement, white dominance is supreme. And it's important for us to have a conversation about how white supremacy has shaped Western political thought for hundreds of years. And because it is not named explicitly, because it is not identified explicitly, it's rendered invisible. And that is really at the core of a lot of the work that we do here at Black. Because of its invisibility, it gets to, again, claim its deniability, right? It doesn't exist. It's all in our heads. And so I think a meaningful understanding of white supremacy is important when we talk about anti-Black racism and racism more broadly. Intersectionality, I'm sure it's, again, a term that all of you have heard before, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it's really just an approach to analyze and understand how race, gender, class, and other identifying factors intersect. And they form one, they can sort of converge and give a person a certain kind of experience. And so at the end of the day, your experience as a Black person cannot be separated from your experience as a woman, as a gay person, as a person of a certain age, as a person of a certain size, right? All of those identity factors intersect together and sort of give you your experience. So now that we've talked about terminology, we can talk about how anti-Black racism actually manifests in real time. So we see anti-Black racism manifest in systems, right? Systems of policing, primarily, racial profiling, over-policing, meaning Black communities are surveyed, hyper-surveyed, especially when we're thinking about even the new provincial legislation that gave police expanded powers, right? That's the kind of thing that we see. We also see under-policing. In the bail system, we see an over-reliance on sureties, conditions, strict conditions for Black people, and strict conditions actually create situations where oftentimes people are breached and then again brought back into the criminal justice system. The reliance on, over-reliance on guilty pleas for Black people. We see it at sentencing in the criminal justice system. So a lack of recognition about anti-Black racism and how anti-Black racism can constrain somebody's choices and what they think is possible for them. We see it in prison conditions. We see it in the child welfare system. We see it in the education system, employment rates, especially given COVID-19, and certainly we see it in the immigration system. So when we talk about anti-Black racism and policing, we're not just talking about the criminal justice or injustice system or policing. We're talking about the surveillance of Black people. So this is a great quote from Raman Maynard in Policing Black Lives, great book. I suggest that you take the time to read it if you can. And she says, policing indeed describes not only the cops on their beat, but also the past and present surveillance of Black women by social assistance agents, the over-disciplining and racially targeted expulsion of Black children and youths in schools, and the acute surveillance and detention of Black migrants by border control agencies. So policing Black people, right? Just watching Black people, surveilling Black people. It's a broader concept. I wanted to touch on some reports that came out from the Ontario Human Rights Commission that speaks directly to the experiences of Black people. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. As of November 2008, the Ontario Human Rights Commission found that a Black person in Toronto was nearly 20 times, right? 20 times more likely than a white person to be involved in a fatal shooting by the Toronto Police Service. And these are important things that we need to consider, especially when we're talking about data collection, data retention. If we're asking for the government to do things for us, we need to be able to track this. And so with the Ontario Human Rights Commission coming out with a report that says that a Black person in Toronto was 20 times more likely than a white person to be involved in a fatal shooting, I think that that kind of information helps us sort of concretely talk about the problems of anti-Black racism and then demand resources and change from our governments. So I thought that this was an interesting thing. I just put in Google, arrest Toronto, and this is what came up. And these are the kinds of innocuous things that we see consistently. And if you look closely, arrest Toronto, Somali comes up. So anti-Black racism is built into the very fabric, built into the very air we breathe. And so this is something I want you guys to consider when we talk about anti-Black racism. Again, think about the microaggressions. You're so articulate. Why would I be articulate? You would assume that I wouldn't be articulate because of my race. And why, when we Google arrest Toronto, do faces of racialized men, in particular Black men, come up, right? Because the presumption is that Black men are criminals. And this again is a quote from the Ontario Human Rights Commission Under Suspicion report. And this quote, I think, perfectly encapsulates the clients that we see at Black, right? As a Black male, people treat me differently. The onus is always on me to debunk people's suspicions. It gets tiring, and without inner strength, there is a tendency to become a constantly angry person who fulfills the script. So that was a Black man between the ages of 45 and 54 who was racially profiled more than 10 times in the span of a year. So imagine how that feels when you're trying to live your life and exist as a human being, as many people are able to do, and because of your race and because of your gender, you're stopped and you're interacted with police. There's a presumption that being who you are and existing is innately criminal. And that can be extremely frustrating. And I think it's important too, and I'll talk briefly about the impact of anti-Black racism, the psychological impact of it, but this idea that you are constantly angry. It is completely reasonable that you would be constantly angry if you're being constantly stopped and harassed by police. It's not an unreasonable position to take. And that in and of itself is used against Black people. So I think this is something important to keep in mind. And again, this is a sort of broader expansion of what the Ontario Human Rights Commission found, aside from the fact that a Black person in Toronto was 20 times more likely than a white person to be involved in a fatal shooting. It's important to remember that, again, right, Black people make up 8.8% of Toronto's population. And yet we're overrepresented in SIU, uses of force cases, shootings, uses of force cases that resulted in civilian death, and police shooting deaths. And specifically when we talk about Black men make up a really small percentage of Toronto's populations. And yet they were a quarter of SIU cases alleging sexual assault by Toronto police. And that is also an area that is not talked about very much, but Black men make up such a small percentage of the Toronto population, and to think about that in proportion to these allegations of sexual assault by Toronto police officers, it's very important, right? When we talk about the disproportionate impact on Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities, this is what we're talking about. And so again, I don't know, there may be young people in this webinar, but the hashtag "if they gun me down," right? That was trending. And it was a challenge, I think, for Black people to say, well, if they gun me down, what picture would they use? What version of me would you offer to the public? The version that reifies your stereotypical notions of who I am. So if you look at these pictures, right? Peace signs, hats, hoodies, or would you use the picture where somebody's graduating, or somebody's in a suit, or somebody's in active service? And so this is the tension I think Black people experience all the time. And again, this is more topical than ever, considering the verdict in George Floyd and the murder of the continued murder of Black people in the United States and in Canada. Okay, so moving away from policing, we see anti-Black racism manifest in child welfare and education, as you know. And that RIP Harimbe Daga Buga, I don't know if you guys are aware of what happened in Durham region with a young person who was graduating from high school and put in his yearbook a sort of reverence to his grandmother, and somebody edited that and put RIP Harimbe Daga. Harimbe is reference to a gorilla that was shot in 2016 at the Cincinnati Zoo. So even our kids in the greatest moments of their lives are robbed of being able to just be kids, right? Because you are alive and you are a Black person. So in education, if we go a little bit deeper, if we're talking about the TDSB, 12% of students in the TDSB are Black. Black students are expelled and suspended at a higher rate. So again, we're thinking about proportion to the general population. We think about 30 to 40% dropout rate. We think about the overrepresentation of Black students in applied courses, right? Applied courses sort of set the trajectory for any other post-secondary or subsequent degrees or like where that person is going to go. But we know Black students are overrepresented in applied courses. We know that Black students are disciplined harsher than compared to their white students, and they're 3 times more likely than white students to be suspended. And again, we see this as young as kindergarten. We see young kids getting handcuffed, expelled and suspended at a higher rate. So anti-Black racism is well and alive in the education system. We also see anti-Black racism in employment. We see the overrepresentation of Black people living in poverty. We see precarious employment. So when you're thinking about even now in COVID-19, we think about if you order Uber Eats or you get a grocery delivery service, right? Think about the people who are doing those kinds of jobs. We see discrimination even in the hiring process. In health, we see, obviously, you guys are all aware, COVID-19 right now is disproportionately affecting Black and racialized and Indigenous communities. And those health inequities are not simply numerical differences. They are unjust indifferences that could be eliminated or reduced by collective action and the mix of right policies. And so think about the provincial government's decision to expand police powers instead of organizing our vaccine program or talking about a racial justice strategy for racialized communities. The communities are being disproportionately affected by COVID-19 to get access to the vaccine, right? These are things that our government could have been doing instead of expanding police powers. So we even see these decisions that are actively an enemy to Black life. In housing, right? And housing is a huge area. So we see Black Canadians living below housing standards. And there's also an issue of crowding. There's maintenance issues that happen quite frequently. And so we see, and housing is connected to everything, right? So housing is connected to policing, and somebody can be facing an eviction if they are suspected to have been engaged in criminal activity. That can in fact impact the entire household. If you're a kid working from home or living from home, think about how those things can then just trickle and trickle and trickle and trickle, right? So this is a really, I think, interesting moment for Black people today. And so this is a chart just to show you how all of those things kind of intersect and sort of create this situation of anti-Black racism that we face as Black people. Okay, and I wanted to talk just a little bit about people of color and anti-Black racism, or other persons of color and other racialized communities. Because privilege and power and oppression is not equitably distributed amongst communities of color, it's important to specifically talk about anti-Black racism. So that doesn't mean that the conversation about racism broadly or the racism that is faced by other racialized communities is not important, but there's a specific benefit to naming anti-Black racism because the experience of Black people is quite unique. And you can see that in the outcomes for our community. I think it's also important to stress that understanding and ending anti-Black racism helps us all, right? It helps other racialized communities, it helps Indigenous communities, right? There's a solidarity I think that we all need to have as racialized communities in dealing with anti-Black racism. So something that I talk about a lot when I talk about anti-Black racism is impact, right? Oftentimes when we talk about anti-Black racism, we say, we hear people, if we have files against someone, they'll say, well, that wasn't my intention. My intention was not to be racist. Well, your intention is irrelevant. It's about the impact. And, if you think about the quote that I put from the Ontario Human Rights Commission, think about the psychological and emotional impact of constantly having to live like that. It's trauma that is passed on to family, friends, the larger social group, and across generations. It can cause psychological stress, physiological stress, behavioral stress, and you get into this racial battle fatigue, which a lot of people are in when you constantly see the death of Black people, young Black people. A 16-year-old girl, there is this sense that you are tired of seeing Black death. And when you add the stress of deciding how to deal with the microaggressive conduct, it can become a really alienating place for Black people and other racialized communities. So I want us to think about that. And for those of you who experience anti-Black racism, I want you also to know that, you're not alone. It's very taxing to do this work. So I'm just going to briefly talk about collecting race-based data. So I talked a little bit about what was happening at the Ontario Human Rights Commission and what our provincial government recently did in terms of expanding police powers. But the importance of collecting race-based data is to support evidence-based service. And that's ultimately what we want, right? We want laws that are evidence-based. We want a COVID-19 response that is scientifically based. So if we're trying to advance racial equity and eliminate barriers, we really need to know the numbers. And that's why, from my perspective at least, the numbers are important. And so the Anti-Racism Act is 2017. It essentially targets Ontario's 3-year anti-racism strategy and establishes a baseline that we have to track race-based data in 3 priority sectors: justice, education, and child welfare. And I think the aim of presenting and collecting that statistical data, again, is that the problems become more visible. The more data we have, the more we can point to legitimacy of the disparities. We all know what the disparities are, but if we want money, right? If we want, again, services that are aimed to address these specific problems, I think making that clear link between situations of oppression and housing, policing, helps us ask for what we need as a community. So I don't know, I think I'm almost at the end, but some of the takeaways that I hope that you can get from the presentation, and hopefully we can talk about in the conversation portion of this, is that addressing anti-Black racism does not equal diversity and inclusion or multiculturalism. We have to think about intersectionality, so how race and other factors intersect with each other. We also have to think about Indigenous and Black people and other racialized people in positions of leadership. We have to broaden the way that we think about racism. Again, we have to focus on impact, not intent. And we have to have a way of addressing these internalized interpersonal forms of racism, or even the institutional forms of racism that are coded and covert and not explicit, right? And that helps them be sort of more invisibilized and insulated. And when they're insulated, they're harder to address. And again, collecting data. I think collecting data is really important. So that's my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Fareeda. I think that's so much information that we are traumatized every day, and then a lot of times they say, "Oh, not in Canada; it's only in US." People are still in denial, so they don't have to deal with what is really exists in Canada as well, and they're just shoveling, and it's in US. We are very racist and very adorable in Canada, especially. Thank you for that. I think there is a lot of question or comment on the chat. We will address it later, and I'm just gonna call Selwyn Pieters, who's not strange, lives in Regent Park. He's a board member and for the Center for Community Learning and Development. So yeah, I'm just gonna call on Toby. He will be reading his Selwyn bio. Thank you, Fareeda.
Yeah, Selwyn is an experienced litigator licensed to practice law in Ontario, the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, and the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. He's appeared at all levels of court, including the Supreme Court in Fraser and Ontario, Quebec and Bombardier, and most recently Toronto versus Ontario, the Bill 5 matter, as well as the Ontario Court of Appeal in Lamb and University of Western Ontario, Toronto and Ontario, Freeman, Malloy and Marsden, Bangor and Washington Post, and the Queen and Steele, as well as the Federal Court of Appeal in Stevens and the Conservative Party of Canada. He's also appeared in numerous trials in the Ontario Court of Justice and the Superior Court of Justice. Selwyn has also appeared before various tribunals in Ontario, including the Human Rights Tribunal, Landlord and Tenant Board and License Appeal Tribunal, in matters too numerous to count. As a criminal lawyer, he's defended clients in simple theft under charges, defended clients from simple theft to charges as complicated as gun, drugs, gangs, and murder cases. Over to you, Selwyn.
Thank you, Toby.
Yes, Toby, you forgot to put your camera on, but that's okay. So Toby, please start the PowerPoint presentation. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I will be speaking about COVID-19 and the police intersected with racial profiling in Ontario. Keep the PowerPoint going. So at the end of this presentation, I expect that participants will be able to describe various orders and police powers relating to the COVID-19 pandemic in Ontario, describe the concerns around these orders and powers relating to police racial profiling, and discuss the various legal avenues for challenging racial profiling under these COVID-19 orders and regulations. Okay, keep it going. Keep it. As you know, on April 1st, there was a declaration that we were facing the third wave of COVID-19 infections in Ontario, and the Premier announced a province-wide shutdown effective April 3rd. On April 7th, the Premier again declared a state of emergency in the province and announced a province-wide stay-at-home order, and the regulation is 265-21, effective April 8th. The order was subsequently extended to at least May 20, 2021. So under the current stay-at-home order, all persons are directed not to leave home except for purposes deemed essential. So gathering outside of one's household and non-essential travel are prohibited. Individuals, according to the order, may be fined for non-compliance, including maximum fines of $100,000 for an individual, $500,000 for a director or officer of a corporation, and $10 million for a corporation. So as you can see there, at least the fine power is dramatic, especially if you live in a low income home or if you don't have money. Even if you have money, those fines are quite disproportionate for someone's liberty. On April 16th, the province announced it has strengthened enforcement to increase public compliance with stay-at-home orders effective April 17th for the duration of that order. And the Regulation 29421 empowers police and other provincial offense officers to require any individual to provide their home address and purpose for being away from their residence and to stop vehicles for this purpose. Initially, the enforcement powers enabled police to stop people at random. That broad power prompted widespread public outrage, with many police force stating they would not use the new power of random stop. There was also complaints from the Black Action Defense Committee and the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers, amongst others. Following the backlash, the day after the regulation was announced, it was amended to require a reason to suspect violation of the stay-at-home order before an individual can be stopped. And that was the Regulation 298. So there have been various other orders made throughout the course of COVID-19 pandemic by the provincial government and other officials. And orders include closure of various types of businesses, prohibiting certain activities, capacity limits in various facilities, both before the stay-home order was made and since it came into effect. And violations are to be met with fines. In my office, we have numerous cases where I'm defending people who were ticketed under the Emergency and Civil Protection Act. These orders are made under several statutes, including the Health Protection and Promotion Act. Section 22 of that act is being used in quite sometimes a discriminatory way. We have a case right now where one region banned the use of hookahs, and the people that use hookahs are people from the Middle Eastern countries, right? So that directly targets them. The Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act and the reopening of Ontario, a flexible response to COVID Act. So the reopening of Ontario Act is one of those acts that is being used as quite a tool right now. Right now, even law firms are targeted by the reopening of Ontario Act. So we deal with orders and racial profiling. And the definition of racial profiling have been dealt with ad nauseum, and I believe Fareeda touched on that. So we'll keep going, Toby. Okay, so we'll deal with this part. The reality is that these new powers given to the police under the stay-at-home order have raised concerns that enforcement will target racialized groups. On April 21st, the Ontario Human Rights Commission released a statement expressing its concern that the new police powers, quote, will likely result in a disproportionate impact on members of marginalized and vulnerable communities, explaining that, quote, broad police discretion is fertile ground for racial profiling, end quote, based on previous research. The Ontario Human Rights Statement calls for a human rights-based response to COVID-19 pandemic, including collection and reporting of race-based data from policing activities and the implementation of, quote, transparent and effective accountability processes to identify, monitor, and address racial profiling. So I think this is important for all of our purposes because this webinar is timely. And when you look at the Ontario Human Rights response that came yesterday, it's telling you that there's a clear and present danger of abuse of policing powers under the various orders released under the Emergency and Civil Protection Act, the Health Protection and Promotion Act, and the Reopening of Ontario's Act. CABLE's response. So the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers have also released a response, and they called on the province to constrain or clarify the recent broadening of police and peace officers' powers due to concerns of likely racial profiling. According to CABLE's statement, and I quote, regardless of the stated intent, we have already heard stories of community members being questioned by police. We know that some law enforcement members apply the concept of reasonable and probable grounds differently for Black Ontarians than for others in society. And CABLE suggests that the new enforcement measures are likely to be contrary to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms under Section 8, which is unreasonable search and seizure, Section 9, arbitrary detention and imprisonment, and Section 15, equality before the law. We know that COVID-19 itself has been found to impact Black and racialized persons disproportionately. And on that subject, it's a shame that where the social determinants of health is concerned, Black and racialized persons are really at the back of the line when you look at who got the first dose and who got the 2 doses of vaccines, and only 2% of Canadians got that vaccine. So we're in a pretty bad position right now in terms of the social determinants of health. So according to the Black Health Alliance, COVID-19 hotspot neighborhoods tend to have a disproportionately high Black population. The Wellesley Institute reports that racialized groups have less access to COVID-19 vaccines than non-racialized groups. And that's what I just spoke about. It's really a problem that's troubling. An Ontario-based study has found that Black Canadians are far more likely to experience serious health consequences from COVID-19 than other groups. The danger of racialized COVID-19 enforcement is all the more disturbing given the racialized impact of the virus itself. We deal with legal resource and avenues for redress for racial profiling. And the law provides various ways for challenging police conduct when racial profiling is suspected. And these include a human rights application to the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, complaints through the Office of the Independent Police Review Directorate, which deals with police misconduct, civil suits against the police, which deals with remedies, including financial remedies against the police, orders and regulations, including the various COVID-19 challenges, may also be challenged directly in court as unconstitutional through applications. Now, the Human Rights Code prohibits racial and other discriminations and allow those who experience it to seek monetary and non-monetary remedies before the Commission or the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, sorry. Accordingly, racialized persons who experience police racial profiling may take their cases to the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. And this would include targeted enforcement of the stay-at-home orders and the use of the new police powers that has a racially discriminatory impact or effect. So if you feel that you were targeted because of your race in part, you can file an application with the Human Rights Tribunal. Okay, skip that. So the benefits of the HRTO process, it's inexpensive. It provides a semblance of justice to victims. You can have free legal advice through the Human Rights Legal Support Center. And certainly these cases can set up precedents, and they could be high profile, high visibility litigation that brings the evidence to light in the public domain. And legal costs are not awarded to the respondents if you lose, so you're not going to be out of pocket if the case isn't as successful as you wanted it to be. The problem with the Human Rights Tribunal is that findings of racial profiling or meeting the tests for discrimination is rare. So you rarely find cases where the Human Rights Tribunal find that there was indeed racial profiling. The limitation period is 1 year. The burden of proof is on the applicant. And direct evidence is rare. Most of the findings are based on circumstantial evidence or social science evidence and sometimes expert evidence. Okay, keep going. So in terms of OIPRD complaints, any civilian who believed to have been subject to police misconduct, including racial discrimination, can make a complaint to the OIPRD. These complaints are then screened by the ORPRD staff and investigated by ORPRD or the police service itself or another police service. Substantiated complaints can be referred to a disciplinary hearing. So these matters are more about police discipline. They're to correct police behavior rather than to give you some form of redress. So it's something important. A complainant do not get money out of an OIPRD process. They may get a letter of apology, but the end result is if a complaint is substantiated, disciplinary action follows for the police officers. So if police engage in discrimination or police misconduct in the course of enforcement of the stay-at-home order, the OIPRD may provide victims with an avenue of redress, and that avenue is disciplinary consequences for the officer. Benefits: the OIPRD conducts a third-party investigation. Hearings provide accountability for the actions of individual officers. misconduct investigated by the OIPRD is not limited to discrimination. It's also touch on policies and practices and procedures. Disadvantage of the OIPRD process: proceedings are disciplinary, not remedial. Victims do not receive damage awards, and I discussed that a few minutes ago. Complaints of misconduct are typically difficult to substantiate, and that goes to the issue of videos. It's good to record police encounters. I mean, as you saw with the George Floyd encounter, a 17-year-old girl really made a difference by pulling out her phone and recording those 9-point-something minutes that George Floyd's neck was held down by that officer. Otherwise, you know, we would not have had the option to see and heard what was going on. So in terms of police misconduct here under the stay-at-home orders, if you have a video, record or ask somebody in the vicinity to record the encounter so that there is a objective recording and video of what took place itself. Suing civilly is also another option for police misconduct. One can sue in small claims court, or one can sue under simplified rules, or one can sue for millions of dollars where the police has misconduct itself. And you know, there are various causes of actions, and one of those causes of action could be breach of the charter, false arrest and false imprisonment, negligence, breach of statutory duties, abuse of public office. You could also seek aggravated and punitive damages. In Perth, the Court of Appeal said racial profiling is wrong. It is wrong regardless of whether the police conduct that precipitates the racial profiling could be justified apart from resort to negative stereotyping based on race. For example, a police officer who sees a vehicle speeding and decides to pull the vehicle over in part because of the driver's color is engaged in racial profiling, even though the speed of the vehicle could have justified the officer's action. And the same logic applies to stay-at-home orders and other COVID-19 restrictions. Obviously, the benefits of suing civilly is an opportunity to recover damages to dignity and special damages. And causes of actions are not limited to discrimination. I mean, a really important concept right now is that the court can consider human rights damages and other damages. And so that's important. 90% of civil cases in Ontario do not go to trial. They're settled at mediation. And we can't really tell you monetary figures due to confidentiality agreements, but these cases are settled for quite high quantums through these insurance companies. And so most times you do get something when you sue. Drawbacks, civil litigation is expensive, time consuming, and uncertain. We say expensive because most times these cases go to discoveries where people are being cross-examined and where a lot of evidence have to be produced to substantiate whatever impact or effects one say they have. So if you say you have a medical condition because of the police actions, the lawyer for the police may ask you to produce your medical records. And they may ask you a whole bunch of questions in respect to aspects relevant to the case and irrelevant to the case. A drawback is that you may be responsible for costs. You may be responsible for costs if you lose. Somebody asked about the damage. Why are damage awards so low? I mean, I think damage awards are low in Canada compared to America. The American concept are damages in the millions and millions of dollars. Yes, and then the person refers to the Peel case where she was only awarded $35,000. I think, and $35,000 in human rights terms, when you look at awards, the typical awards is between $2,000 and $10,000 at the Human Rights Tribunal. So I agree that those awards at the tribunal are quite low. It's better you settle the case outside of trying to go to a full hearing. The awards in those circumstances are quite higher. The only problem with those awards is those awards aren't public, and you can't make them public because of confidentiality agreements. Drawbacks, findings of liability in Ontario for racial profiling is pretty low. Let's keep going to the recent cases. Keep scrolling forward. So applicants can challenge the orders themselves in court on the grounds that they're unconstitutional. So any of these COVID-related orders could be challenged. We have a few challenges in court right now. I was the lawyer who was on the case where we challenged the bylaw that prohibited persons from sleeping in parks. And so when you look at the people that are sleeping in Moss Park, Island Gardens, and so on, it was two lawyers, myself and another lawyer named Brendan Jowett. And as a result of our work, they continue to be able to sleep in those parks. The Black Action Defense Committee, BATC, and the Canadian Civil Liberties Association very early in the game signaled their intent to challenge the expanded police powers under the stay-at-home order. And on April 17th, the Black Action Defense Committee announced its intention to launch a charter challenge against the new police powers, which it stated, quote, will lead to tragedy in Ontario if not overruled. BATC, in a press release, stated, therefore, granting police powers to stop and question citizens and force citizens to provide personal identification to the police and to tell the police where they live, where they're going, and for what purpose is not only a fundamental breach of people's rights, but the information that they provide could be used for other nefarious purposes to the detriment of the individuals, as was exposed by the MacDonald Commission into police wrongdoing. But in addition to that, the police also had a carding system where they were collecting identifying information of Black people and brown people for the most part, and keeping it in a database. And there were class action lawsuits and others. And of course, there was Justice Tulloch report that looked into the carding and brought in legislation to deal with it. In any event, the application by the Black Action Defense Committee has not taken shape as yet because of the walk back by the provincial government on its initial orders for the police to stop and demand identification and the movements of people. And to conclude, Ontario's various COVID-19 related orders, including enhanced police powers, raise concerns of possible racial profiling and other excesses and abuse by the police. Whether and if racial profiling or other forms of abuse and excesses occur in the enforcement of these provisions, it may lead to proceedings in many different forums, including the HRTO, OIPRD, civil suits, and charter challenges to the orders. And I would encourage persons on here who has that experience or know people who have that experience to contact me or any other human rights Black or any other human rights lawyers so that we can provide you with timely advice and we can take the case to one of these forums or more than one of these forums if the factual basis exists. I want to thank everyone for tuning in and listening to this talk, and myself and Fareeda will be available for questions.
Thank you so much, Selwyn. I think we should have this conversation every month. There is people who are not aware of what is happening and they are in denial or not aware of at all, but there is so many gaps that exist in the community and everywhere. You mentioned about suing the police and stuff. The people who are a lot of time who are being in the community who are putting in jails, their parents, their siblings, they are working precarious jobs and they don't have time to fight the police as well. And their case is not getting anywhere. I'm glad that you highlight that because, and I've been seeing the police took cell phone of the teenager. So while they documenting all of the footage of what is taking place, and when they give them back and they wiped all of the document that is happening, racism is not new, but what is new is everything is captured in the camera and everybody has cell phone as we speak. And I think everybody could document if they see any racism that towards Black people or minority as well. If there is any question, maybe you could raise your hand. Mary could facilitate that part as well. Thank you so much, Selwyn.
Thanks so much, everyone. And thank you, Surya. Yes, so if you have a question or like to add to the discussion, please use the raise hand function. You can find it under reaction and leave it up just to make sure we see you. You can also write your question in the chat, and then when it's your turn, you'll be able to unmute yourself to speak. So I'll just turn it over to Haja.
Yeah, we have another question in the chat for Cheryl. Hi, Cheryl.
Hi, I think Mr. Pieters actually answered the question regarding the Peel student who,
Okay.
yeah, so thank you.
I think Brandon, his hand is up. Maybe you could pass it to Brandon.
Yeah. Hi, Brandon, are you there?
Or Bernadette?
Yes, I am.
Hello.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much. Yes, this is she. Thank you very much. I had a question in regards to around human rights and protection pertaining to the COVID-19 situation. What I've observed and also experienced is that there are certain people in the society that are either not wearing their masks, or they will lower their masks and they will deliberately cough on non-white citizens, either aiming towards the head or aiming towards the jackets. I myself have taken to wearing a scarf on my head when I go outside as another measure of protection. So considering that this is pandemic, and what some of these people are doing is essentially biological warfare. What can be done in particular for non-whites, in particular Black people, to protect themselves when situations like this arise?
Well, certainly, I mean, there are different layers to the question or the answer to the question that you ask, and the question is very important. Firstly, you bear in mind that if a person is positive for COVID-19 or any other transmittable disease, the Health Protection and Promotion Act comes into force, and the Quarantine Act comes into force. So that if somebody is sick and they deliberately flaunt the quarantine law, the Health Protection and Promotion Act laws, they're subjected to charges and significant fines. Another thing is if somebody lowers their mask and cough on you.
Sorry, if you are not speaking, Mickey, you could put on your mute, please.
Yeah, if somebody coughs on you and they're ill, or even if they're not ill, they give you the impression that they're ill, that can be a criminal charge of mischief if you want to go that way. So there are any number of consequences if somebody decides to antagonize you using the virus itself.
Thank you so much. What I find that is also difficult, just to add to the context of it, is that oftentimes these are people that I don't know. I'll just be walking down the street and, just as, some would be just saying the N-word for whatever reason. I don't know these people, but this is what they choose to do. So oftentimes they're strangers. I don't know where they live. I don't know their name. I don't know their status. So it just makes it all the more harder to even track them down. I mean, I could go walking around with my phone to see, but I can't to see if I can capture an image of them. But the times that I've experienced, they'll just cough and walk away. I don't know why they would do that. It's just diabolical to me, but I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
No, but let's assume that you want to pursue something, right? There's no reason for you to pursue the person. You can dial 911 if you think it's an emergency, or you can call the police. The thing about it is in 2021, almost everywhere you go has cameras. And so it's easy to track someone down if it's really serious and the police wants to get to that person. They will have footage, and you may well take a photo or a video, but nearby businesses or the streets may have cameras. That's if it's serious and you need to, you have a significant fear for your safety or your life. The police may well track the person down.
Thank you for that. Dani, I saw you, but can I read this question for Benji? Okay, the question is, how are people to deal with the situation when stopped by the police?
Okay, I can tackle this one. So essentially the same way that you would deal with police in a non-emergency order context is the same way you would deal with police in this context. So if police are stopping you, you should stop, right? There's no, it's not helpful to resist or to potentially engage more criminal charges, but you do have the right to know for what purpose the police are stopping you. So you can ask those questions, right? Am I being investigated? Am I being charged? You have no obligation to say anything additional to that. If police are saying you're contravening any of the emergency orders, and although the legislation has changed a little bit, so now the law actually does not allow police officers to stop you if you're walking on the street or if you're driving a car. They've changed it because of the public outcry, and that's why it's so important to do this. But let's say you were walking and a police officer stopped you. the police officer would tell you why they stopped you. And if they thought that you're contravening an order, they would give you a ticket. If not, you are free to go. And you can ask the police officers if you're free to go. If they decided to charge you, then again, you would say, well, what am I being charged with? And then they will lay a charge on you. But I think it's really important to just make sure that your interaction is clear. I think I saw a question in the chat that's related to that. So somebody said, it's important to record interactions. Yes. If the police then threaten you with a mischief charge, or an obstruction charge, well, one, you have to make sure that you're not actually obstructing anything, right? So you're not in the mix. So you want to stay far away, but then keep that camera on. And if you are far away, you're not in any conceivable way obstructing the police to be able to do whatever they're supposed to do, and that's illegal. You are allowed to record police interactions.
Okay, thank you for that. Denny, you're next.
Oh my gosh.
You're muted. You're muted.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question about if the factual basis exist piece, a case can move forward in light of microaggression. And I'm wondering if you could provide a few examples of what that factual evidence would be that people would need to bring forward. Because it's so subtle, but it's so real. And, I'm wondering how many cases, can move forward and succeed when the actual attack was microaggressive.
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's take the example of the Human Rights Tribunal. So Selwyn talked a little bit about the Human Rights Tribunal. It's one of the areas that we work at at Black. So let's take the employment context. If your boss made some comments about, again, I'm surprised that you did really well on that project, or you were so articulate. Racial discrimination cases at the HRTO, at least the HRTO has acknowledged that circumstantial evidence is going to be predominant in racial discrimination cases. So a lot of the evidence that we're going to rely on is going to be inferences and what we know about institutional and systemic racism. So for example, if you are qualified, your boss is making these subtle comments, but for some reason you've been held back for a promotion, or for some reason someone's junior to you is going ahead of you. All of those things can be used to create a circumstantial sort of narrative about racial discrimination. And the thing is at the Human Rights Tribunal is that when you make an allegation of racial discrimination, the HRTO actually accepts it, and it's up to the respondent to provide a rational explanation for whatever behavior. So for example, if you're being held back and you watch your junior people exceed you and pass you, you might say, the tribunal might say to the respondent, okay, so explain that, right? And sometimes there's a valid explanation and sometimes there's not a valid explanation. If you think about the education context, often what we do at Black is disproportionate discipline for Black students, right? So oftentimes you'll see a fight between kids and the Black student will be suspended for 3 days and the white student will get an in-school suspension. Well, if the behavior is all the same, why is there a disproportionate, right? So there's no direct evidence, but we can sort of infer through the totality of the experience that there is no other reasonable explanation for what is going on except for racial discrimination, if that's the case, right? You have a white student or a non-Black student and a Black student. So yeah, it's really tough. And Selwyn was right, and I think the person asked about the case where the young child was handcuffed. Racial discrimination cases, unfortunately, don't yield big awards at the HRTO, and they are quite small. And $35,000 in the scope of awards is actually a high award. And I know that it's can be very difficult to hear that, but it's actually quite outside of the scope, right? That we generally see the racial discrimination cases settle for. So those are the frailties of relying on the legal system to address these issues, right? They're hard, but we still have to bring them, right? Because we have to push the law forward for Black people in this province.
And you gave me an example from employment and education. Could I get one from an encounter with police?
Yeah, well, I mean, police, it's a little bit different because police, we can say it's all clear, right? So usually what we encounter is that police will charge somebody with something they shouldn't have been charged with a breach or use of force, right? So disproportionate use of force. You know, if you have a client who is alleged to have contravened a bylaw and 7 officers show up on the scene and she has bruises all over her body, right? So that is something that clearly shows a disproportionate amount of force to the situation. And then you would say, well, why? And then we would rely on what the Ontario Human Rights Commission has said about disproportionate impact of use of force cases on Black people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But with policing, you can do the OIPRD method, right? The police oversight body, which is, again, like Selwyn said, you're not going to get a remedy from that. You're in the sense that you're going to get money, right? It's really going to be about whether or not the police officer engaged in misconduct. That's the question for the OIPRD. If you want to go to the Human Rights Tribunal, that's where there's a little bit more leeway for options and remedies and that kind of thing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Gilliam? You're muted, sir. Okay.
Yeah.
You're still muted, sir. Yeah, you need to unmute.
Let me see again.
Yes,
yeah.
Okay, you're good.
Yeah, so I say I want to, first and foremost, I want to congratulate the organizers of this forum because this is very timely and very informative for participants and the broader community, because these are unusual times. We have lived with racism ever since Europeans settled in North America, and but it is we have seen different situations in which it is more clearly expressed. We have seen the whole issue and very well documented regarding police abuse and this type of thing, and thank goodness for the advent of the cell phone with good cameras, that now people are able to capture evidence, video evidence, to bring these things to light. With respect to the extraordinary powers that the police, that the premier gave to the police in this order, that went further. Only under the War Measures Act has police ever had those powers. And this goes beyond the scope of provincial authority to invoke the War Measures Act. So in our estimated, I represent Black Action Defense Committee, and as a result of that, when I saw that press conference, I immediately reach out to determine to a board and so on that we need to intervene on that. And I'm glad there were several other organizations, the Civil Liberties Association, etc. But what was very striking, even the police union opposed it. The police union is the best ally of the conservative government. And even they oppose this because they know it was going to lead to severe tragedies. So this is one thing. So it's a great thing that they walked it back. There are still precarious situations that will develop because there will still be more police contact, but it's not the random stops. I wanted to comment briefly on the whole issue of the anti-Black racism component and where the and white supremacy and where it all started. It was in 1492 that Christopher Columbus made a voyage here. And the following year, Pope Alexander VI of Rome issued a papal bull called Inter Carta, in which he congratulated the King and Queen of Spain, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, for supporting and financing Columbus's voyage, in which he discovered new lands, mainlands, and islands. Those are direct quotes, with people. And he commanded them to take charge and occupy those lands and dominate the people. Those are identical terms. Because if they were not Christians, they were not humans. And all of the activity of the settlers from there on were following those orders, and their actions demonstrated that they did not see these people as real humans. And they've been treated in very barbaric ways while they claim that these people are barbaric and barbarians and so on. So this is the genesis of this, and all institutions in the Western world have been founded on those constructs. So it is a very tall order to eradicate it, but we have to keep fighting.
Thank you for that.
You're muted. I can't hear.
Oh, thank you. Project, you're next.
Hi, so just two questions. So the first one, based on the fact that it's been established that the Ontario Human Rights Commission give low awards for the severity of the cases, such as a 6-year-old who was shackled like an enslaved African, hands and feet, 6 years old, remember, hands and feet were handcuffs, and she was on her stomach for 28 years. Only $35,000 was awarded. So with that in mind, and several other cases in mind, will the Association of Black Lawyers and all other racialized lawyers and groups and organizations actually start looking at the Human Rights Commission to increase the awards given connected to anti-Black racism, also based on the fact that Toronto has recognized that anti-Black racism is a mental health issue. And we've been saying that for years, with the understanding that you've got Joy DeGrue's post-traumatic slave syndrome, the imprint of trauma that runs through our DNA generation after generation scientifically. So we've got that impact running through our genes and DNA as we evolve and as as we descend through time, and also the additional piece of white supremacy and anti-Black racism. So is there a way that collectively we can start moving forward to have higher award amounts, especially now knowing that the American system has, awards higher? That's the first one. Secondly, is there I'm a teacher, an actor, teacher activist, and I work and volunteer with several organizations and students, all students, specifically Black students. So is there a go-to guide or a guide of some sort, a reference, a checklist that we can just print off and hand to our Black students and Black youth to say, look, if you're stopped, here is a quick go-to reference list to support you, in that hostile situation. Thank you.
Selwyn, do you want to go?
Okay, thank you.
I can't hear you, Selwyn.
I thought Fareeda was going to take the second question, so I was waiting for her. So I'll answer the first question. The first question is with respect to the damage awards from the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario that you're concerned about. I think the push right now is to say, look, the Human Rights Tribunal do award very high awards, financial awards in sexual harassment cases, and very low awards in racial harassment, racial profiling, and discrimination cases. So we're trying to push the tribunal adjudicators, because they're the people who render these decisions, to understand the serious and the deleterious effects of these situations when there's a finding of liability made, when they're dealing with the remedial aspects. You know, we're trying to do that, but there's also the civil aspect, right? Because the courts can consider the human rights code now as well, despite the sort of disadvantages of civil litigation, where you're exposed to costs, where you're exposed to the discovery process, and it could be long and drawn out. Sometimes the civil litigation process is the way to go. We're dealing with a case right now of a mixed couple, a black and white couple who moved into a neighborhood, and because the black man is 6'7", he's going through all kind of stuff. And, you know, we could have gone to the Human Rights Tribunal with that application, but instead we took it civil, where we're seeking hundreds of thousands of dollars because this young black man is being tormented. And so, you know, he came to me as a right person, because I understand his situation, and we're going to litigate it. So the people that are trying to force him and his wife to sell their home are going to have to come through the civil litigation process rather than a human rights tribunal process where you're forced to mediate and settle, but the settlements are low. You know, we'll have to see whether there's a change in the mindset of the tribunal members in terms of settlements, but I think that it might be something that needs to be addressed on judicial review and have higher courts comment on these quantum of damages.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I think the forum that you decide to resolve your issue in is very important. The Human Rights Tribunal is not a punitive forum, right? It's a remedial forum. And I think that sort of adds to this idea why the monetary damages are relatively low. But I think in terms of pushing the damages higher, there is a case, and I can send it to you, that that involves racial discrimination, where the tribunal accepted the lawyer's argument that setting awards low can be a license fee to discriminate. So if you experience racism and you know, you're an organization, you decide to condone it and not do anything about it, and then you go to the Human Rights Tribunal and you settle for $5,000, that's the license fee to discriminate. And so at least when we're doing human rights files, we always push, right? I'm not going to ask for less, I'm going to ask for more. And I'm going to challenge the HRTO adjudicators to see what I'm seeing. But Selwyn is right. Ultimately, if the adjudicators don't see the legitimacy in racial discrimination cases in terms of like high monetary damages, then we're probably going to have to go to higher courts and ask higher courts to clarify what adjudicators can and cannot do in a racial discrimination case. In relation to your second question, there are some resources about, just quick resources about what to do when you're stopped by police. So you can use Steps to Justice. We've linked all of those materials on our website at the blacklegalactioncenter.ca. And you can also, on our Instagram, we also just posted a quick Know Your Rights kit, what to do when, in the context of these emergency orders in particular, what to do if you're a young person. It's all cute and on Instagram for the young people, so look at that as well.
Thank you very much for that. Gordon, Mr. Gordon, you're next. Mr. Gordon?
Hello, my question was answered. I put it in the chat and it was answered already.
Okay, that's great.
Thank you.
Miguel? Miguel?
Hi there. Thank you so much for this presentation, Fareed and Selwyn. I know both of you guys. I also recognize a lot of people in the chat that are longtime activists. Um, well, I agree with the notion of increasing their awards for human rights cases. You know that Toronto police budget is $1.1 billion and it's paid through your property taxes. Each time you pay taxes to the city, that goes into the pocket for sorry, it goes into the budget allocation for the Toronto police. Now, this is the sad part about this. None of the award money comes from the pockets of the police officers or the police union. Is money paid to the risk management office or the city solicitor who covers the insurance for damages, punitive damages awarded by the HRTO. Guess what? You pay for that insurance program. You taxes pay for that. So at the end of the day, it's a circle. You pay your taxes, you you get hurt by the police, those taxes come from your own pocket. Stop the insanity, we have to say that. We have to stop the insanity. We have to say enough is enough. You hurt us, you harm us, you discriminate us, you harass us, you pay for that those damages. Stop asking the people to pay for those claims. Now, another sad fact, and the lawyers will know this, and all the activists know that when you go to the HRTO, there is something called the resource center that they provide you some guidance to fill up the application. The problem is they won't assign you a lawyer to if you go on the to fight the officer. The opposite party will bring a lawyer from the city solicitor's office, or they will bring a lawyer from the police services board, or the union will pay a lawyer for the police officer. You are competing against a Goliath. You are the little David. And the little David has to be so clever, you have to read books of law. You have no idea how many books I have read through the years about police brutality and accountability. You are in disadvantage when you deal with the police HR claims on the HTO. You must have a lawyer. Unfortunately, you have to hire a lawyer. And the other sad part is that Legal Aid Ontario will not give you a legal aid certificate to fight the police. It all comes from your pocket. You have to either mortgage your home, if you have a home, you have to remortgage again, you have to borrow money to pay for the lawyer's fees, or you have to sell your soul to the devil again for the third time. I sold my soul to the devil 2 times already, so I don't have no more soul to sell. So you see, this is the injustice in the system. I'm sorry I had to be blunt, but these are the injustice that happened into our communities and to taxpayers at the end of the day. Thank you very much. I just want to make a comment based on my living experiences, okay? I'm not exaggerating. Like I said before, I have seen names on the chat that are longtime activists, and I have my respect for each one of you. Thank you.
Miguel, well, let me respond to you in part because I think it all depends on where you go. Like I do, and my student will tell you because he's on the line. He's on the Zoom. He works full time doing human rights applications. So, and we don't take any money up front from anyone. Most of the kids that come to us that were racially profiled by the police, racially profiled by the TTC, racially profiled by Go Transit. I do a whole bunch of cases involving racial profiling and discrimination. And most of the people cannot pay upfront. So it all depends on which lawyers you go to. Some of us don't charge you to draft your application, to file your application, or do any of that. We just take, we don't even make money off of these cases. We take a percentage of the settlement. Most times it's like 20% settlement we take. So if you get $10,000, we take $2,000. And that doesn't even compensate for the time that we spend on the case, but it's doing justice as part of what we do for people who are low income and people who suffer disparate impact of the system. So you don't necessarily have to sell your soul to lawyers. It all depends on which lawyers you go to. I haven't had anyone sold their house yet to pay me, and I don't really pressure people to pay me. We write off some of the costs. If you can't afford us, it's a tax benefit at the end of the year that we can write off the costs or write off the bill. So, I want you to understand that because not every lawyer is going to demand, but if you go to, let's say you want to go to one of the Five Sisters or one of the big law firms, or you just see somebody's name in the newspapers and you don't research that lawyer properly, well, that's on you. When the lawyer tells you, okay, well, what assets do you have? Can you sell it? Can you pawn it? That's not how I practice law. You could come to me without, actually, most of the people that come to me in human rights cases do not pay upfront. I want you to know that. And a lot of human rights lawyers are like that. You go to Ron Franklin, you go to Nia Singh, any of those lawyers, they're not going to ask you to pay upfront. So, the human rights legal support system works well, but they don't have infinite resources. They have one or two staff lawyers. And so, sometimes you could tap into the appropriate lawyers in private practice and they will help you.
Thank you, Selwyn. While you're here, maybe you could talk about the news that we've been working on since last year. There is a petition going on right now. We posted on the chat. Maybe you could talk about why the news wasn't considered hate crime. Maybe you could highlight a little bit.
Soraya, Dini is waiting. She has her hands up for a while.
So the petition will be lost in the middle. So he's gonna be 2 minutes.
Okay.
No, let her go ahead. Let Danny go ahead.
Okay, hi, Dini. You need to unmute. Yeah.
I was going to say, Soraya, go ahead. Okay. I'd like some people to sign this petition.
Thank you, Dini. Maybe Salwat, go. Maybe you could highlight on the news.
Yes. So we had a coalition. We had a coalition that dealt with this issue of the news, and there were several actions that were taken to sort of show that we did not approve of how the matter was handled. So we had a discussion group which commenced certain actions with the police outside of 55 Division. Also a letter to the Attorney General asking that hate crimes charges be laid against the person who put the news up at the Michael Garron Center. And you all would know that out of fortuity, or it may be deliberate, I don't know, but there was a single vehicle accident about a month ago where the person smashed his vehicle into one of the concrete standards in Mississauga and died. So that case, the Michael Garron Center case, in terms of criminal prosecution, ended with the death of that man through a single vehicle accident. But there have been a lot of other instances, including Regent Park and another recent news incident that occurred. So because of the news and its historical linkage to slavery and lynching, some of you will recall that Black people being hung in the center squares and off of trees used to be entertainment for white folks, some white folks. And so the news has a historic terror bearing on Black people, especially. And so we would ask you to continue to sign the petitions that are out there and to support us when these incidents happen, because quite frankly, when these significant incidents of racism occur, regardless of how you see us moving around, we're traumatized. I know even as a lawyer, I'm traumatized. I can't lie. I'm traumatized by some of these cases, and we certainly ask that you support us.
Thank you so much. And the petition is on chat. Please support and share and sign the petition. Thank you. Take on, Hajja.
Okay, I now have can I
Yeah.
now ask my question? Yeah?
Yes,
Okay.
Kim.
Okay, here's my hard question. When there's blatant systemic racism in all levels of the Canadian court processes, how can Indigenous and Black people expect to receive justice from a tainted court process that has an unquestionable conflict of interest as a racist contaminated system? Selwyn, can't hear you, you're muted.
I know that the system has been pretty hard for Aboriginal persons. Let's deal with Aboriginal persons firstly. We know that the system has been very difficult for Aboriginals. That's why there have been these various commissions. And that's why there's a concept now of Gladu courts. So you have a system populated by either persons sensitive to Aboriginal issues or including Aboriginal workers, judges who are culturally sensitive, lawyers who are culturally sensitive, and Crown attorneys who are culturally sensitive. I don't disagree with you that our justice system, because I'm a justice system participant as a lawyer, I don't disagree with you that our justice system has significant problems, including issues concerning race and including issues concerning the treatment of Indigenous offenders or persons that get in contact with the law. It's important for everyone to be sensitized to these issues, including judges and lawyers, and they are doing that through various programs. And I'm not going to write off the system itself. I think what needs to happen at this point, one of the things that need to happen is more Black judges, more Indigenous judges, and as you have that critical mass, people will be more sensitive, because I agree with you that in a system where it's mostly white, very upper class, like where I work with 4 to 5 lawyers, and I was the first Black lawyer in this chambers. I brought a few younger lawyers here where I work, but most of my colleagues out of the 4 to 5 lawyers here didn't had Black friends, and they're very influential. And if you're not interacting with Black people on a personal level, most of your concept of Black people are based on stereotypes. And it's the same that happened with judges. A lot of the judges are these lawyers who are appointed. And if they're doing bail hearings or if they're doing criminal trials and all they're seeing or hearing is the worst of Black people through these projects, etc., then that's the stereotype that they get. And so you fall into that cycle where, yes, Black people are disproportionately denied bail. Black people are subject to harsher sentence. The comments from the judiciary are insensitive, etc., etc. So you raise a significant point, and sometimes, and Fareeda is going to tell you, sometimes it could be very lonely in the court if you're in a toxic and poisoned environment. And sometimes as lawyers, if we're in a court where a judge is racist and the Crown attorney has a racist predilection about Black people, and the police are there and everybody's on a tunnel vision, to conviction, you can feel that poisoned atmosphere.
I do agree that the restorative justice courts have made a difference. And that impacts on the individual. And I think sometimes my view is a little bit broader, you know, when you see the issues around the Indigenous land rights, you know, going to the Canadian courts just doesn't seem to me to be something that can be very successful for the reason that they're in a conflict of interest. Like, I just don't know how to break out of that tunnel or how we'll break out of that, but it's like set up for failure.
Yeah, well, that's a little beyond the scope of our discussion
Gotcha,
today.
gotcha. Yeah, I told you it was a hard question.
Yeah, I'll just say one quick thing, and yeah, it's a little outside the scope of what we're talking about here, but I think that fighting anti-Black racism is a group project, meaning everybody has their role. And so as lawyers, we can all acknowledge the frailties of the legal system to really institutionally dig out this rotting anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, all of it. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And that's why, you know, when I see the activists doing what they do, and the teachers doing what they do, and the students doing what they do, I'm like, this is a group project. And I think we all have to work at it together, and you know, it's like we were told this is since the genesis of this country, so it's gonna be a pretty difficult cancer to uproot, really, you know. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try.
Yeah.
Thank you, Fareeda. Is there any more question? I think that's the last.
No, yeah, Soraya, that's the last question, and ask
say thank you for presenters, Fareeda, Selwyn. We really thank you. I think this is not time off or once a year. I think this we need to peel it, I would say, and go deeper, and we need to have a lot of education and awareness that this exists. Racism is alive, racism is out there, and people need to understand the impact it has in the Black community, in the minority as well. And we're seeing in COVID put it on the surface. It's not new. The racism that exists everywhere that we have seen and witnessed. What is new is everybody's capturing it in the video and their cell phone. Thank you all of the panelists and the organizer, Hajja, Ines, Mark, Mary, Lloyd, who were planning this to make it happen. And I just want to thank you